There's no question the rollout of Massachusetts recreational marijuana law has been bumpy. It was 2 long years between the time the law first passed and the state's first pot shops finally opened. But for people of color, who this law was supposed to prioritize, with licenses for growing, processing, and selling, it has been a disaster. It took more than 3 years for the first pot shop to open under the state's equity program, which was the part of the law meant to make sure the new industry would give priority to Black and Latino communities, which were hit hardest by the war on drugs, where people were arrested and jailed at much higher rates than their white neighbors. Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to establish such a program, but nearly 4 years on, there's not a whole lot of equity to be found. That's why a coalition of activists, entrepreneurs, and regulators are pushing state lawmakers to pass new laws that would make the old law honor its mandate, in part via virtual rallies.
We refuse to also allow this new industry to be built on our backs. If Black lives matter, so does Black wealth, so do Black entrepreneurs. We are not asking for handouts. We are not objects of missionary charity. We are demanding justice and equal access to opportunity.
The chair of the state's Cannabis Control Commission, Stephen Hoffman, and one of its commissioners, Shaleen, were at that virtual rally as well, and followed up with an op-ed in the Boston Globe writing, "We take responsibility for not yet reaching our goals. We commit to maximizing our impact, but we cannot do it alone." Shaleen, who also co-authored the recreational marijuana ballot question, joins me now. It's great to see you, as always. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
I want to repeat this. This is the law. This is not a goal. That those from communities hit hardest by the old laws are supposed to be prioritized as beneficiaries. That is the law of Massachusetts. Is that not right?
That's absolutely right. It's been 4 years, and this is not a new initiative. This is trying to implement the law as written.
Okay, and passed by the voters. So let's go down the list, if we can, and for a couple of minutes, of the law changes that you and Hoffman and other activists and advocates are urging the legislature to do. One is that some of the fees and fines go into no-interest loans that are available to social equity and economic empowerment applicants. I assume it's obvious why, because capital is most easily available to the big boys, not to the startups. Is that why?
Well, we're asking for fines and donations to be able to expand our equity program. And this is a good example of the kind of barriers we face, because the law states very clearly that the commission can accept donations and use them, yet we don't have an actual mechanism to take the donations, put them into an account and use them. So it's a very technical challenge that we have, and we're simply trying to use those donations and fines to support our equity program, which is quite successful and growing very fast.
And by the way, this is not like while your equity language was the first in the nation, in great part thanks to you, other states are doing a variation on this. The Californias, the Illinois, others are doing it, I assume, with some success, correct?
Yes, I think we are lagging quite a bit behind other states at this point. Illinois has put a full 25% of its cannabis tax revenue towards grants for harmed communities. Wow. And California has put $40 million since October into cannabis equity grants.
Okay, second thing on your agenda, it seems to be pretty obvious. Approval of marijuana cafes with a highest priority given to the same applicants, same kinds of applicants, economic empowerment, social equity. And I assume that's obviously because they're less capital intensive and it's an easier entry point. Am I right about that?
We're trying to make it that way, certainly. Of course, public health and public safety are going to be an issue as well. But we have, at the commission level, passed a pilot program. We worked with municipalities, and we did put these aside for equity businesses for 2 years. It's just, again, a technical challenge to allow municipalities to opt in. That's what the bill would do.
Okay, let's go to the third item, and I left it to the bottom because it's so enraging as far as I'm concerned. These host agreements now have to be negotiated between the applicant and local cities and towns. And to use a word that has been used by far more responsible people than me, they often become shakedown exercises by local officials, and in some cases, alleged extortion. You can just ask the former mayor of Fall River, who is standing trial next year and had to step down from his job because of this alleged extortion. What you guys are asking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the way to fix this is rather than taking away from cities and towns that are essentially bending, if not breaking the law and making demands that, you know, may technically or not technically violate the language of the law, give oversight to the commission itself, which means, you're nodding, does oversight mean final sign-off with the commission rather than the city or town? What power would you gain from this?
So ideally, what I would love to see is consistency where the state has to be equitable and so does a city or town, because that's causing problems right now. But this bill would just do a small thing. It would allow the commission to enforce the limits in the law about host community agreements. Because you're not actually supposed to be able to use them as shakedowns.
So if they are engaging in, quote, shakedown activity, you could say that's not in compliance with the law, rather than someone having to go through endless litigation. You'd have that power. Is that essentially what you're talking about?
Right, they wouldn't be able to move forward because they wouldn't have a valid host community agreement.
Okay, so you have to explain something else to me that I do not understand, and I'm sure I've asked you this before, so my apologies. My understanding of the law is that the state, in its decision-making, that would be you and your colleagues, must prioritize equity. But cities and towns do not need to prioritize equity. I don't get that at all. Is that so that cities and towns can engage in this kind of behavior, or what's the thinking behind that kind of language?
I don't get that either, Jim, honestly, but you have it exactly right. And that's what I just hinted at in my last answer, which is there is this fundamental inconsistency where if you ask the state agency to be equitable, but every single business must have some form of local approval, and cities and towns don't have to be equitable, it just doesn't make any sense. And we've been pointing this out now for going on almost 4 years. So it's about time for it to be addressed.
Okay, in my contract, I'm allowed one really stupid question a month, and I'm going to use my question for July right now. Why would anybody in the legislature oppose any of these ideas?
You know, I have had really good experience with legislators. These bills have all been vetted, passed committee, gone through the relevant process, but now we're nearing the end of the session, and it's a matter of urgency, and it's a matter of what's a priority. And I would argue this needs to be a priority. This was a key piece of our law, and we don't need to be asking communities of color to wait any longer. It's been 4 years.
Well, especially now, by the way, despite, you know, all the rhetoric we hear from elected officials about their concern about this great racial reckoning. Well, one of the laws that had a racial reckoning in it was the law that you helped draft, and they can make it real or not. Here's my analysis, with which I know you will completely mostly disagree, but I got to get it out of my system. The voters totally supported the equity concept. Some of the commissioners support the equity concept. I don't want to put you in a tough spot. We won't name names. And if the legislature cared about the equity concept, they'd do something about it. Not only do I not think they support that, I think the evidence about the slow implementation of this suggests they don't really support the underlying law. Where am I wrong there?
I would agree with a part of that, which is that it often feels like the same system that created these inequities really wants to keep the inequities. And so there's a constant struggle here that I don't think other industries or other people who aren't trying to fix inequities would face. And you quoted Shaleen earlier from our rally. He said, if you don't agree with this to policymakers, we're going to have to take back your postings about Black Lives Matter. And, you know, you're honoring tributes to John Lewis. You have to be able to back that up with action.
Well, it's an opportunity to walk the walk instead of the BS talking the talk that every politician can do. You know, why should the average person care that you succeed in this? Let's say they're a non-marijuana user, or whether they are not. Why should they care that you and the chairman and the other advocates here are successful in getting these law changes? Why should it matter to them?
Well, because cannabis tax revenue is pretty significant. So even if cannabis doesn't affect your life, licensing doesn't affect your life, you're a taxpayer. Cannabis tax revenue is something that you should have a say in. And the question is, where is it going to go? Does it go to repair the harms of the drug war, or is it going to police or somewhere else?
So one of the things I'm fairly good at is math. And I believe today is the 22nd. I hope that's right, which means there are 9 days to the end of the legislative session. They may stay a little extra. It's unclear. Realistically speaking, this is not front burner stuff right now for Beacon Hill. Do you honestly have hope that in the next 9 days, any or all of these three, there's actually a fourth thing too, which we don't have time for, that these things will go from back burner to Charlie Baker's desk?
You always ask me if I'm hopeful, and I always say yes. I think actually, if you look at yesterday, you looked at the police reform bill where cannabis tax revenue was being directed to police. People had quite a strong reaction to that. And the next day, we saw amendments that addressed it. So I think when people make their voices heard, they are responding to.
You know, Shaleen Tuttle, I really appreciate the fact, regardless of where people are on this issue, that you're working so hard to honor the will of the voters. That means a lot. Thanks so much for doing it, and talk to you again soon.
Thank you.